You know how this one ends. Girl gives up her voice for legs, falls for a prince who never really sees her, loses him to someone else. And on the last night she's handed a knife, kill him, take back her life, or don't, and turn to see foam by sunrise. You know which one she picks. Every version you've ever heard, she picks the knife down. She dissolves. She becomes nothing, quietly, for love, not this time. Tonight she picks the knife up, and what happens after is not what you think. This is the tide that chose her. Marin had lived 17 years under the water and never once envied the surface. Not until the night she watched a ship break apart in a storm and pulled a drowning man from the wreckage with her own hands. His name was Prince Alaric, though she didn't know that yet. She only knew the weight of him against her shoulder, the strange warmth of a body that breathed air instead of water, and the way his eyes opened just once before he lost consciousness again, long enough to find her face and hold it, like he was trying to memorize something he already sensed he wouldn't remember. She left him on the shore before the fishermen found him. That was the rule. That had always been the rule the sea took. The sea gave back nothing, and certainly never showed itself. But Marin broke the rule that night in a smaller way first. She stayed in the shallows until she saw him wake, saw him look around confused and alone on the sand, and something in her chest did something it had never done before. It ached for a stranger. Her grandmother, the sea matriarch, noticed the ache before Marin ever said a word about it. The old woman had lived 400 years under the water and had learned to read her granddaughters the way sailors read weather. "You want to know what it costs," her grandmother said, not a question. "I want to know if it's worth it," Marin said. Her grandmother's silence was its own kind of answer. The sea witch's true name was Eira, and here is where the old story gets something badly wrong. Eira was not a villain hiding in a cave, cackling over a cauldron of desperate girls. Eira had once been exactly what Marin was now, a young woman of the sea who fell for someone above the waves, made the trade, and lost. She had lived on land for 11 years, mute and human, watching the man she loved marry someone else because she could never explain, never correct a misunderstanding, never do anything but watch. When her time ran out, she chose the foam rather than the knife, and something about dissolving into the sea instead of dying completely had transformed her into something between a ghost and a witch, old magic, old grief, calcified into power. She told Marin all of this before the bargain was struck, not as a warning exactly. As a fact, laid out plainly, the way you'd tell a fellow traveler about a road's dangers before they chose to walk it anyway. "Every girl who comes to me thinks she'll be the exception," Eira said. "I was going to be the exception too." "Then why help me at all?" Marin asked. "Because sometimes the story needs someone new to happen to," Eira said, and there was something unreadable in her face, not malice, not quite kindness either. Something more like curiosity, the particular hope of someone who has watched the same tragedy repeat for 100 years and is quietly, desperately waiting for it to go differently just once. The price was the same as every version of this story. Marin's voice, cut away and kept in a shell, in exchange for legs that would feel, with every step, like walking on broken glass. 3 days to make the prince fall in love with her, or she would dissolve into sea foam at the next sunrise after his wedding to someone else. But Eira added one thing the old story never mentions. She gave Marin a knife, not as a cruel afterthought on the final night, but now, at the very beginning, hidden in the folds of her first human dress. "Everyone remembers the ending where the knife appears at the last moment like a trap," Eira said. "I want you to have it from the start. I want you to know, every single day on land, that you always had a choice. That's the part they leave out. It was never a trap. It was always a choice. The story just waits until you're most exhausted to remind you that you have won." Marin found the prince on the 3rd morning, on the very beach where she'd left him. He didn't recognize her, of course he didn't. He'd been half-drowned and delirious. But something in him startled anyway, some deep, unplaceable familiarity, the way you sometimes recognize a stranger's laugh before you recognize their face. He took her in without question, the way kind, lonely princes do in every version of this story. He called her his silent miracle, his mystery from the sea. He walked her through his gardens, his libraries, his kingdom, and every day Marin fell for him a little more and understood, with growing unease, that being fallen for and being seen were not the same thing. Because here is the part the old stories tell honestly, and Marin lived it exactly as painfully as every mermaid before her. Alaric was kind to her the way you're kind to something small and lost. He never once asked who she was before the shipwreck. He never wondered what she'd given up to be there. He liked her silence. She began to realize, liked it a little too easily, the way some people like partners who take up very little space. On the second night, he told her, gently, over wine she couldn't drink and couldn't explain why. You know, I think I'm supposed to marry the girl who actually saved me from the wreck. My father found her, some visiting princess from the north. Apparently she was seen pulling me from the water. It's practically already arranged. Marin sat perfectly still. She could not correct him. She could not say, it was me. It was always me. I am the girl who saved you. I gave up my voice and my whole world to find you again. Because the price of her legs was silence, total and absolute, and no ache in her chest could undo that bargain. This was the trap the old story warns about: mistaken identity, a false savior stepping into the role that belonged to someone else. Marin had heard this part of the tale 100 times as a child, sung by her sisters, and had always believed the tragedy was the mermaid's silence itself. She understood now that the real tragedy was smaller and crueler than that. The tragedy was watching someone be kind to you while building an entire love story around a version of you that didn't need to speak, and then losing him anyway to someone who could. The wedding was arranged for the third night, his, to the northern princess, whose name was Odessa, and who arrived by ship with an entourage 2 days later. Here is where the old story gives you its cruelest turn. And Marin lived through every second of it exactly as the old songs described, watching Alaric's face light up for someone else, watching him take Odessa's hand with the exact same gentle wonder he'd once aimed at Marin, watching the wedding preparations move forward around her like whether she had no power to stop, while she stood mute at the edges of every room, smiling because smiling was the only performance left available to a girl with no voice. Her sisters came to her the final night, having traded their own hair to Eira for one final gift. The knife's power renewed, its blade now carrying old sea magic that would restore Marin's voice, her tail, her whole world beneath the waves, if she used it on Alaric before dawn. His blood on the blade and the bargain would reverse. He would live. He simply wouldn't remember her, and she would go home whole. If she refused, she would dissolve into foam at sunrise, gone completely, remembered by no one. This is the moment every version of this story has trained you to expect grief. The girl stands over the man she loves with a knife she cannot use. She weeps. She drops it into the sea. She dissolves nobly into foam, and the story calls this beautiful, calls this the price of real love, and asks you to cry and admire the tragedy of a girl erasing herself for someone else's happiness. Marin stood over Alaric's sleeping form with the knife in her hand, exactly as the story demands. And she did not raise it against him. But she did not drop it into the sea either. Here is the twist the old story never gives you, because the old story was never written by anyone who survived it. Marin turned the knife over in her hand, looked at Alaric's peaceful, unknowing face, kind, yes, but never once curious enough to ask who she really was, and understood with total clarity that the choice in front of her had never actually been him or the foam. That was Eira's trap disguised as a story, repeated for 100 years, and Marin was the first one to see all the way through it. She turned the knife on herself, not to end her life, but to cut, in one motion, the small enchanted cord at her own throat that Eira had hidden there on the very first night, sealed beneath her collarbone, the true source of the silence bargain. Eira had told her the truth about the choice being always available, but had never told her this, that the same blade that could kill a prince could, if aimed inward with enough courage, break the spell at its actual root, instead of at the tragic ending the story insisted on. It should not have worked. No mermaid in 400 years had ever tried. It worked because Marin was the first one who ever looked for a third option, instead of the two the story offered her. Her voice tore back into her throat like a wave returning to shore, raw, immediate, agonizing, and entirely hers. She did not turn to foam. She did not transform back into a mermaid either. She simply stood there, human, whole, bleeding slightly at the collarbone, alive in a way that belonged to no version of the story anyone had ever sung to her. Alaric woke at the sound of her first real cry, an actual voice, finally, after 3 days of silence, and found her standing over his bed, knife in hand, blood at her throat, and an expression on her face that had nothing to do with fear or grief. "I saved you," she said, and her voice, hearing itself for the first time, cracked on every word. "From the wreck, it was me, not Odessa. Me. I gave up everything to find you again, and you never once asked who I actually was, because you liked me better when I couldn't tell you." This is where the old story would end in tragedy, or in the softened Disney version, in a hasty marriage that papers over everything Marin had actually lost to get there. Neither happened. Alaric did not marry Marin. This is the part that surprised everyone who ever heard this story afterward, including Marin herself in the days that followed. He sat with what she told him, really sat with it, for hours, through the night, and when morning came, he said the only honest thing he had left. "I think I fell in love with the story of rescuing someone quiet enough to need me completely. I don't think I ever once fell in love with you telling me who you actually were. I'm sorry. You deserve someone who wanted to know, not someone who liked that you couldn't say." It was the kindest, most devastating thing anyone had ever said to her, and Marin understood, hearing it, that this too was a kind of ending the old songs never prepared her for. Not tragedy, not triumph, just two people being honest about a love that had been real, and also, somehow, entirely built on the wrong foundation. She did not marry the prince. She did not return to the sea either, Aira told her, when she finally went back to the shore, that the spell she'd broken had changed something permanent. There was no going back to what she'd been, only forward into whatever she chose to become next. "What happens to the girls who find the third option?" Marin asked her. "I don't know," Aira said, and for the first time in 400 years, something like hope moved across her ancient, grief-worn face. "You're the first one who ever looked for it. Maybe you tell me." Marin built a life on the coast between both worlds, not fully of the land, not fully of the sea, working as a healer for sailors' wounds, keeping a small boat that she sailed at dawn when she missed the water most, and telling her own story, eventually, to any girl who came to that shoreline looking desperate and lost, looking for a witch, looking for a bargain, looking for a prince to complete a story that was never actually about him at all. She always told them the same thing Aira had told her, but she added one line of her own, the line she wished someone had given her from the very beginning. "There's always a third option. The story just doesn't want you looking for it, because a girl who saves herself doesn't need anyone else's ending." She kept the knife. She never used it again. She didn't need to, so tell me, was that a happy ending or something else entirely? Because Marin didn't get the prince, but for the first time in every version of this story ever told, she got herself back completely. And maybe that's the real twist. The story was never asking, does she get the prince? It was asking, does she get to keep her voice? This time, she finally did. If you found yourself hopping, she'd raise that knife the old way, and then felt something shift when she didn't tell me in the comments. I want to know exactly where the story surprised you. And if you want to see which fairy tale gets flipped next, hit subscribe and ring the bell, because next time, the story you think you know is going to break in a completely different direction. I'm Lily, and this has been a different story to tell. See you in the next one.